Before I begin, a brief word of explanation, in case you are surprised at hearing foreigners so often referred to by Greek names. The reason is this. Solon intended to use the story in his own poem, and when on inquiring about the significance of the names, he learnt that those Egyptians who first wrote them down had translated them in their own language. He went through the reverse process, and as he learned the meaning of the names, wrote it in Greek. My grandfather had his manuscript, which is now in my possession, and I studied it often as a child. So if you hear names like those we use here, don't be surprised. I have given you the reason. The story is a long one, and it begins like this. We have already mentioned how the gods distributed the whole earth between them in larger or smaller shares, and then established shrines and sacrifices for themselves. Poseidon's share was the island of Atlantis, and he settled the children born to him by a mortal woman in a district of which I will now describe. From the sea extending across the middle of the whole island, there was a plain, said to be the most beautiful and fertile of all plains, and near the middle of this plain, about 50 stades inland, a hill of no great size. Here lived one of the original earth-born inhabitants, called Evenor, with his wife Leucippe. They had an only child, a daughter called Cleito. She was just of marriageable age when her father and mother died, and Poseidon was attracted by her and had intercourse with her, and he fortified the hill where she lived by enclosing it with circlet rings, alternately of sea and land, and of varying sizes, 2 rings of land and 3 of sea, which from the centre of the island he turned as if with a lathe and chisel, and that they were at every point equidistant from each other, thereby making the hill inaccessible to man, for there were still no ships nor sailing in those days. Poseidon easily set in order the central island, in the manner one expects of a god. He made 2 springs flow, one hot and one cold of water, and caused the earth to grow abundant produce of every kind. He begot 5 pairs of male twins, brought them up, and divided the island of Atlantis into 10 parts, which he distributed between them. He allotted the elder of the eldest pair of twins his mother's home district, and the land surrounding it, the biggest and best allocation, and made him king over the others. The others he'd made governors, each of a populous and large territory. He gave them all names. The eldest, the king, he gave the name from which the whole island and surrounding ocean took their designation of Atlantic, deriving it from Atlas, the first king. His twin, to whom was allocated the furthest part of the island, towards the Pillars of Heracles, and facing the district now called Gadria, was called in Greek Emulus, but in his own language Gadarus, which is presumably the origin of the present name. Of the second pair he called one Amphias and the other Euaemon. The elder of the third pair was called Menessus, the younger Orthochaphon. The elder of the fourth Eleusippus, the younger Mestor. The name given of the elder of the fifth pair was Aesus, to the younger Diaprepus. They and their descendants for many generations governed their own territories and many other islands in the ocean, and has already been said, also controlled the populace this side of the Straits as far as Egypt and the Tyria. Atlas had a long and distinguished line of descendants, eldest son succeeding eldest son, and maintaining the succession unbroken for many generations. Their wealth was greater than that possessed by any previous dynasty of kings, or likely to be accumulated by any later, and both in the city and countryside they were provided with everything they could require. Because of the extent of their power, they received many imports, but for the most of their needs the island itself provided. It had mineral resources from which were mined both solid materials and metals, including one metal which survives today only in name, but was then minted in quantities in a number of localities in the island. Oricale, in those days the most valuable metal except gold. The island offered a plentiful supply of timber for structural purposes and fed every kind of animal, domesticated and wild, among them numerous elephants, for there was plenty of grazing for this largest and most ferocious of beasts, as well as for those creatures whose habitat is marsh, swamp and river, mountain or plain. Besides all this, the earth bore freely all the aromatic substances it bears today, roots, herbs, bushes and gums eschewed by flowers or fruit. There were cultivated crops, cereals which provide our staple diet, and pulse, to use its generic name, which we need in addition to feed us. There were the fruits of trees, hard to store but providing the drink and food and oil which give us pleasure and relaxation, and which we serve after supper as a welcome refreshment to the weary when appetite is satisfied. All these were produced by that sacred island, and still beneath the sun, in wonderful quantity and profusion. This then was the island's natural endowment, and the inhabitants proceeded to build temples, palaces, harbours and docks, and set in order the country as a whole in the following manner. Their first work was to bridge the rings of water round their mother's original home, so forming a road to and from their palace. This palace they proceeded to build at once in the place where the god and their ancestors had lived, and each successive king added to its beauties, doing his best to surpass his predecessor, until they had made a residence whose size and beauty were astonishing to see. They began by digging a canal 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and 50 stades long from the sea to the outermost ring, thus making it accessible from the sea like a harbour, and they made the entrance to it large enough to admit the largest ships. At the bridges they made channels through the rings of land which separated those of water, large enough to admit the passage of a single trireme, and roofed over to make an underground tunnel, for the rims of the rings were of some height above sea level. The largest of the rings, to which there was access from the sea, was 3 stades in breadth, and the ring of land within it the same. Of the second pair of rings of water was 2 stades in breadth, and the ring of land again equal to it, while the ring of water running immediately around the central island was a stade across. The diameter of the island on which the palace was situated was 5 stades. It and the rings and the bridges, which were 100 feet broad, were enclosed by a stone wall all around, with towers and gates guarding the bridges on either side where they crossed the water. The stone for them, some white, some black and others red, they cut out of the central island and the outer and inner rings of land, and the process evacuated pairs of hollow docks with roofs of rock. Some of their buildings were of a single colour, in others they mixed different coloured stone to divert the eye and afford them appropriate pleasure, and they covered the whole circuit of the outermost wall with bronze, as if applying a varnish, and they fused tin over the inner walls, and organic gleaming like fire over the walls of the Acropolis itself. The construction of the palace within the Acropolis was as follows. In the centre was a shrine sacred to Poseidon, and Plato surrounded it by golden walls through which entry was forbidden, as it was the place where the family and the 10 kings was conceived and begotten, and there, year by year, seasonal offerings were made from the 10 provinces, to each one of them. There was a temple of Poseidon himself, a stayed in length 300 feet wide and proportionate in height, though somewhat barbarian in appearance. The outside of it was covered over with silver, except for the figures on the pediment, which were covered with gold. Inside, the roof was ivory, picked out with gold, silver and orichalc, and all the walls, pillars and floor were covered with orichalc. It contained gold statues of the god standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, so tall that his head touched the roof, and round him, riding on dolphins, a nereid, that being the accepted number of them at the time, as well as many other statues dedicated by private persons. Round the temple were gold statues of all the wives and descendants of the 10 kings, and many other large vow offerings of kings and private persons belonging to the city and its dominions. There was an altar of a size and workmanship to match that of the building, and a palace equally worthy of the greatness of the empire and the magnificence of its temples. The 2 springs, cold and hot, provided an unlimited supply of water for appropriate purposes, remarkable for its agreeable quality and excellence, and this they made available by surrounding it with suitable buildings and plantations, leading some of it into basins in the open air, and some into covered hot baths for winter use. Here, separate accommodation was provided for royalty and for commoners, and again for women, for horses, and for other beasts of burden, apportionately equipped in each case. The outflow they led into the groves of Poseidon, which, because of the goodness of the soil, was full of trees of marvellous beauty and height, and also channelled it into the outer ring islands by aqueducts at the bridges. On each of these ring islands they had built many temples for different gods, and many gardens and areas for exercise, some for men and some for horses. In particular, in the middle of the larger island there was a special course reserved for horse racing, its width and straight, and its length, that a complete circuit of the island. Round it on both sides were barracks for the main body of the king's personal guard. A more select group of the more trustworthy were stationed on a smaller island ring nearer the citadel, and the most trustworthy of all had headquarters assigned to them in the citadel, and were attached to the king's person. Finally, there were good dockyards full of triremes, and their equipment all in good shape. So much then for the arrangements of the royal residence and its environs. Besides the 3 outer harbours, there was a wall beginning at the sea and running right around in a circle at a uniform distance of 50 straight from the largest ring and harbour, and returning on itself at the mouth of the canal to the sea. This wall was densely built up around with houses, and the canal and large harbour were crowded with vast numbers of merchant ships from all quarters, from which rose a constant din of shouting and noise day and night. I have given you a pretty complete account of what was told me about the city and its original buildings. I must now try to recall the nature and organisation of the rest of the country. To begin with, the region as a whole was said to be high above the level of the sea, from which it rose perpetuously. The city was surrounded by a uniform flat plain, which was in turn enclosed by mountains which came right down to the sea. This plain was rectangular in shape, measuring 3,000 stades in length, and at its midpoint 2,000 stades in breadth from the coast. This whole area of the island faced south and was sheltered from the north winds. The mountains which surrounded it were celebrated as being more numerous, higher and more beautiful than any which exist today, and in them were numerous villages and a wealthy population, as well as rivers, lakes and meadows which provided ample pasture for all kinds of domesticated and wild animals, and a plentiful variety of woodland to supply abundant timber for every kind of manufacture. Over a long period of time, the works of a number of kings had effected certain modifications in the natural features of the plain. It was naturally a long, regular rectangle, and any defects in its shape were corrected by means of a ditch dug around it. The depth and breadth and length of this may sound incredible for an artificial structure when compared with others of a similar kind, but I must give them as I heard them. The depth was 100 feet, the width for every point a stade, and the length, since it was dug right around the plain, was 10,000 stades. The rivers which flowed down from the mountains emptied into it, and it made a complete circuit of the plain, running around to the city from both directions, and there discharged into the sea. Channels about 100 feet broad were cut from the ditch's landward limb, straight across the plain, at a distance of 100 stades from each other till they ran into it on its seaward side. They cut across channels between them and also to the city, and used the whole complex to float timber down from the mountains and transport seasonal produce by boat. They had 2 harvests a year, a winter one for which they relied on rainfall, and a summer one for which the channels, fed by the rivers, provided irrigation. The distribution of manpower was as follows. Each allotment of land was under obligation to furnish 1 male leader of a military detachment. Each allotment was 10 square stades in size, and there were in all 60,000 allotments. There was said to be an unlimited supply of men in the mountains and other parts of the country, and they were assigned by district and villages to all the leaders of the allotment. The leader was bound to provide a 6th part of the equipment of a war chariot, up to a total complement of 10,000. With 2 horses and riders, and in addition a pair of horses, without a chariot, a combatant with light shield, who descends from the chariot to fight, the charioteer who drives the horses and sits behind a combatant, who fights from the chariot, 2 hoplites, 2 archers, 2 slingers, 3 light-armed stone throwers, and 3 javelin men, 4 sailors as part of a complement of 1,200 ships. Such were the military dispositions of the royal city. Those of the other 9 varied in detail, and it would take too long to describe them. The arrangements for the distribution of authority and office were as follows. Each of the 10 kings had absolute power in his own region and city, over persons and in general over laws, and could punish or execute at will. But the distribution of power between them and their mutual relations were governed by the injunctions of Poseidon, enshrined in law and engraved by the first kings on an orifelt pillar in the temple of Poseidon in the middle of the island. Here they assembled alternately every 5th and 6th year, thereby showing equal respect to both odd and evil numbers. They consulted on matters of mutual interest and inquired into and gave judgment on any wrong committed by any of them. And before any prospective judgment, they exchanged mutual pledges in the following ceremony. There were in the temple of Poseidon bulls roaming at large. The 10 kings, after praying to the god that they might secure a sacrifice that would please him, entered alone by themselves and started a hunt for a bull, using clubs and nooses but no metal weapons. And when they caught him, they cut his throat over the top of the pillar, so that the blood flowed over the inscription. And on the pillar there was engraved, in addition to the laws, an oath invoking awful curses on those who disobeyed it. When they had finished the ritual of sacrifice, and were consecrating the limbs of the bull, they mixed a bowl of wine and dropped in a clot of blood for each of them, before cleansing the pillar and burning the rest of the blood. After this, they drew wine from the bowl in golden cups, pouring a libation over the fire, and swore an oath to give judgment in accordance with the laws written on the pillar, to punish any past offences, never knowingly in future to transgress what was written, and finally neither to give nor obey orders unless they were in accordance with the laws of their father. Each one of them swore this oath on his own behalf and that of his descendants, and after drinking dedicated his cup to the god's temple. There followed an interval for supper and necessary business, and when darkness fell and the sacrificial fire had died down, they all put on the most splendid dark blue ceremonial robes, and sat on the ground by the embers of the sacrificial fire. In the dark, all glimmer of fire in the sanctuary being extinguished. And thus they gave and submitted to judgment on any complaint of wrong made against them, and afterwards, when it was light, wrote the terms of judgment on gold plates, which they dedicated together with their robes as a record. And among many other special laws governing the privileges of kings, the most important were that they should never make war upon each other, and come to each other's help if any of them were threatened with the dissolution of the power of the royal house in his state. In that case, they should follow the custom of their predecessors and consult mutually about policy for war and other matters, recognizing the suzerainty of the house of Atlas. But the king of that house should have no authority to put any of his fellows to death without the consent of a majority of the 10. This was the nature and extent of the power which existed in those parts of the world, and which God brought to attack our country. His reason, so the story goes, was this. For many generations, so long as the divine element in their nature survived, they obeyed the laws and loved the divine to which they were akin. They maintained thoughts that were true and in every way lofty, treating the vagaries of fortune and one another with wisdom and forbearance, as they reckoned that qualities of character were far more important than their present prosperity. So they bore the burden, as it were, of their wealth and possessions lightly, and their wealth did not make them drunk with conceit, and so lose their self-control and falter, but they saw soberly and clearly that all these things flourish only on a soil of common goodwill and virtue, and if pursued too eagerly and overvalued, destroy themselves and virtue with them. So long as these principles and their divine nature remained unimpaired, the prosperity which we have described continued to grow. But when the divine portion in them became weakened by frequent admixture of a large quantity of moral stock, and their human traits became predominant, they ceased to be able to carry their prosperity with moderation to the prospective eye, and appeared shameful, since they were destroying the finest of their most precious possessions. But to those whose judgment of true happiness is defective, they seemed, in their pursuit of unbridled ambition and power, to be supremely fine and blessed. And the God of gods, Zeus, whose reign by law, and whose eye can see such things, when he perceived the wretched state of this admirable stock, decided to punish them and reduce them to order by discipline. He accordingly summoned all the gods to his own most glorious abode, which stands at the centre of the entire cosmos, and looks out over the whole realm of becoming, and when he assembled, he spoke.